Morning. A private heliport outside Los Angeles. Sunlight glints off a luxury helicopter worth $15 million. Inside the hangar, elite technicians are sweating, failing to find a deadly vibration in the tail rotor. Sophia Langford, the brilliant but arrogant CEO, is losing her patience. Suddenly, a man in a grease-stained maintenance jacket walks in with his 9-year-old daughter. Sophia looks at his old boots and smirks. "Fix my helicopter, and I'll kiss you." The room erupts in laughter. The man stays silent. He looks at the rotor. And then his daughter speaks. The air in the room freezes. "Now, watch him." The morning air in the private hangar was heavy with the scent of high-grade aviation fuel, industrial floor wax, and the quiet, mounting anxiety of 4 elite technicians. In the center of the vast, white-tiled space sat the Aero Vanguard S9, a masterpiece of carbon fiber and precision engineering. It was the flagship of Langford Aerospace, a vessel designed to carry the most important people in the world across the Southern California coastline. But right now, it was nothing more than a $15 million paperweight. Sophia Langford stood by the cockpit, her arms crossed tightly over her designer blazer. At 32, she was the youngest CEO to ever dominate the aerospace corridor. She was a woman of absolute logic, blinding speed, and zero tolerance for failure. She had built her empire on the idea that every problem had a mathematical solution, but for the last 6 hours her best engineers had been stumped. The tail rotor system had developed a harmonic vibration during the high-altitude test cycle. It was a frequency that suggested catastrophic structural failure, yet the computers insisted every bolt was tight. If they couldn't find the source by noon, the demonstration flight for the international investors would be canceled, and her company's stock would crater before the opening bell. "We've recalibrated the entire torque-sensing hub," the lead technician, a man named Marcus who held 3 Ivy League degrees, said as he wiped sweat from his forehead. He looked exhausted, his white lab coat stained with the sweat of frustration. "The diagnostic software says it's perfect. Every sensor's in the green. But every time we hit the second cycle, the resonance returns. It's a ghost in the machine, Sophia. We might need to scrap the airframe and start from zero." Sophia's jaw tightened until it felt like glass. She stared at her reflection in the polished black skin of the helicopter. "I don't pay you for ghosts, Marcus. I pay you for certainties. The board is on my neck. The press is at the gate. Find it or find a new career." Just then, the heavy sliding doors of the hangar groaned open, letting in a shaft of harsh morning light. A man in his early 40s stepped into the vast space. He wasn't wearing the pristine white coats of the elite engineering team. Instead, he wore a faded navy blue maintenance jacket with a frayed collar and permanent oil stains on the elbows. His work boots were scuffed, and he carried a weathered leather toolkit that looked like it had seen decades of service in the trenches of the industry. Beside him was a young girl, about 9 years old, holding a sketchbook and looking up at the high rafters with wide, inquisitive hazel eyes. "You here for the HVAC system?" Marcus asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't even look at the man's face, only the grease on his jacket. "The service elevator is in the back. This floor is restricted to technical staff only." The man didn't flinch. He didn't even slow his pace. He walked slowly toward the helicopter, his eyes scanning the lines of the tail boom with a strange analytical intensity that didn't match his humble appearance. "No," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone that seemed to settle the frantic energy of the room. "I'm here to check the rotor sync. My supervisor said you were having a little difficulty with the handover." Sophia turned around, her eyes scanning the man from head to toe. She saw a nobody. She saw a man who probably spent his days fixing lawnmowers or small prop planes at dusty regional strips. The pressure of the day, the looming financial disaster, and the arrogance of her own success finally boiled over into a sharp, mocking bite. She wanted to humiliate the man who had the audacity to suggest her elite team was having difficulty. "Is that so?" Sophia said, a cold, playful smirk appearing on her lips. She stepped closer, the clicking of her heels sounding like an executioner's march. "Listen, Mr. Mechanic, this aircraft costs more than most neighborhoods. My engineers have 600 combined years of experience. They use AI models and cloud-based simulations. But if you can find the vibration that they can't, I'll give you a kiss right here in front of everyone. How's that for an incentive? The hangar went silent for a heartbeat. Then the technicians burst into shallow, arrogant laughter. Marcus snickered, leaning against a work table. Careful, pal. You might smudge her makeup with that grease. You probably should have washed your face before you tried to play hero. The man didn't join the laughter. He didn't even look at Sophia. He kept his gaze fixed on the helicopter's tail assembly, ignoring the social theater entirely. The silence he projected was heavier than the noise in the room. He walked up to the edge of the rotor, his movements rhythmic and unhurried, the gait of a man who moved with the patience of physics. Lily, his daughter, tugged on his jacket sleeve, her voice a soft whisper in the huge room. Dad, is that the one? The one you were talking about at breakfast? The one with the crying bearing? The man nodded once, a brief, silent confirmation. He looked at the machine not with awe, but with a quiet, practiced familiarity. He didn't know that Sophia Langford had just made a joke that would change the trajectory of her company's soul. He was just a father who understood that a machine, like a person, only screams when it isn't being heard correctly. And he was finally listening. Marcus stepped in front of the man, blocking his path to the maintenance panel. Look, pal, we appreciate the ambition, truly. But this isn't a tractor or a used sedan. It's a multi-link servo system governed by a state-of-the-art AI flight control computer. You don't just look at it and fix it. You need a terminal to even talk to the logic board. Why don't you go back to the service bay and wait for a real job? Have you ever worked on a helicopter before? A real one? Another technician asked, his arms crossed over his chest, blocking the man's view. The man paused, his hand resting gently on the side of his leather toolkit. The leather was dark and worn where his hand gripped it most. A little, he replied. The brevity of his answer was jarring. He wasn't trying to sell himself. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just there. Sophia leaned against the hangar wall, checking her watch with a theatrical sigh. Give him 5 minutes, Marcus, she said, her voice full of a bored, mocking irony. Let's see the little mechanic at work. It'll be a good story for the investors when we explain why we're 30 minutes late to the presentation. Our janitor had a theory. The man ignored the jab. He walked slowly around the tail section, his fingers tracing the seams of the composite skin. He wasn't looking at the paint, the luxury leather interior, or the gold-plated controls. He was looking at the way the light hit the fasteners. He was looking at the tension of the hydraulic lines. He stopped at the very end of the boom, right beneath the secondary rotor hub. Did the vibration start after the second flight cycle? The man asked, his voice cutting through the snickering. The laughter in the room stopped instantly. It was as if someone had turned off the sound. Marcus and the other 3 technicians exchanged a sharp, confused glance. They hadn't released the flight logs to anyone. They hadn't told anyone about the second cycle timing. That was proprietary data. Yes, Marcus said, his tone shifting from mockery to a guarded suspicion. How did you know that? Who have you been talking to? Are you with a rival firm? The man didn't answer. He pointed toward the engine housing with a grease-stained finger. The logs would show a thermal expansion of 0.04 millimeters in the secondary cooling duct. That's enough to shift the weight of the sink shaft when the metal is hot. Start the system again. Low RPM. I want to hear the handover from the primary to the secondary gears. Sophia stood up straight, her eyes narrowing. There was something in the man's voice, a resonance, a weight of authority that didn't match the oil-stained jacket. It was the voice of a man who had given commands to things much bigger and much more dangerous than a luxury helicopter. Start the systems, Sophia commanded. Her voice was no longer mocking, it was dangerously curious. The technician in the cockpit engaged the startup sequence. The turbines whined to life, a high-pitched scream that echoed off the hangar walls and vibrated the glass in the ceiling. The main rotors began to turn with a slow, heavy thump, 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 followed by the faster sweep of the tail rotor. As the RPMs climbed to 50%, a low-frequency hum began to vibrate the floor, a deep, jagged thrum that sounded like a groan of pain. The man stood perfectly still, his back straight. He closed his eyes, his head tilted slightly to the left. He wasn't looking at the digital gauges or the diagnostic screens on the tablets. He was listening to the metal. He was feeling the frequency through the soles of his boots. He looked like a composer listening to a symphony with one wrong note. Lily stood beside him, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She looked at her father with absolute, unshakable confidence. She had seen this look before, the look he had when he was solving the world's problems at their kitchen table. She leaned over to one of the technicians who was staring at them in silence. "You hear it, right?" Lily whispered, her eyes bright. "The little click inside the hum? It only happens when the wind is high. That's the part that's crying because it's lonely." The technician looked at the girl, then back at the man. He didn't hear a click. He just heard the roar of 15,000 horsepower. But he didn't laugh this time. The man opened his eyes. "Shut it down," he said. The authority in his tone was absolute. It was a command, not a request. The pilot in the cockpit obeyed instinctively, cutting the power before Marcus could even think to protest. As the rotors slowed to a stop, the man turned to Sophia. He didn't look like a mechanic anymore. He looked like a master who had just found a flaw in a student's work. The mockery of the room was gone, replaced by a thick, heavy tension. Everyone was waiting for him to fail, but for the first time that morning, they were also starting to wonder if he was the only one who actually knew what was happening. The man didn't reach for a diagnostic laptop or a wireless probe. He reached into his leather bag and pulled out a simple, high-grade torque wrench and a fiber optic probe he had built himself. "Open the technical panel behind the aft cabin bulkhead," the man directed, his eyes fixed on the metal. "The one that houses the primary synchronization gears for the tail assembly." Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed with professional ego. "That area was already checked, sir. We ran a full ultrasound on those gears 3 hours ago. There isn't a single fracture. The tolerances are within factory specs. You're looking in the wrong place. We need to focus on the software logic." The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Marcus with a gaze that made the lead engineer feel like a child on his first day of school. "Check it again," the man said, "but don't look for a fracture. Look for the shim alignment on the tertiary bearing." Sophia walked over, her heels clicking a sharp beat on the white tile. She stood just inches from the man, the smell of his engine oil clashing with her expensive perfume. She could see the fine lines of age and experience around his eyes. "Marcus, open the panel. Now. I want to see this." The technicians scrambled. They unscrewed the high tensile bolts and pulled back the carbon fiber cover, revealing the intricate golden-hued gears of the rotor sync system. It was a beautiful, terrifyingly complex piece of machinery that few people in the world understood. The man knelt down, inserting his fiber optic probe into a narrow gap between the primary gears. He studied the small screen on his handheld device for 10 seconds, then 20. Then he looked at Marcus. "There," the man said, pointing to a tiny, almost invisible sliver of steel. "The thermal shim is misaligned by 0.75 millimeters. When the engine is cold, it sits perfectly. But after 2 flight cycles, the heat makes the titanium housing expand just enough to push that bearing out of its track. It's not a failure, it's a drift. At high speed, that 3/4 millimeter gap causes a harmonic resonance that will eventually snap the tail boom. Your software didn't catch it because the sensor is programmed to look for breaks, not movements." Marcus grabbed his own digital calipers and leaned in. He measured the gap once, then twice. His hands began to shake. He looked up at the man, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound, crushing embarrassment. "He's right," Marcus whispered to the room, his voice barely audible. It's a manufacturing drift. The ultrasound missed it because the metal isn't cracked. It's just 1 millimeter out of place when it's hot. We would have lost the helicopter in the air." The hangar went deathly quiet. The elite engineers, the men who had laughed at the greasy mechanic 10 minutes ago, were now looking at the floor. They had spent $250,000 on diagnostics and 10,000 hours on AI simulations. And a man in a faded jacket had found the problem by listening to the hum of the blades. Sophia Langford felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She looked at the man, really looked at him for the first time. She noticed the way he held the tools, the muscle memory of someone who had done this under the most extreme pressure. She noticed the calmness of his eyes. "You spotted that just by listening?" Sophia asked, her voice hushed with a new kind of awe. The man stood up, wiping his hands on a clean rag he pulled from his pocket. "Engines are like heartbeats, ma'am. If you've heard enough of them, you can tell when one is skipping a beat. It's not magic. It's just paying attention to what others ignore." Sorry, sure. One of the junior technicians, a young man who had been the loudest with the jokes, stepped forward. "Where did you learn this? You don't just pick up that kind of hearing in a local repair shop. Who are you?" Before the man could answer, Lily looked up from her sketchbook, her voice clear and full of a daughter's unshakable pride. "My dad used to be the one who made the helicopters fly before anyone else was allowed to touch them. He was a lead engineer for the experimental flight test program at the National Defense Lab. He says if the machine doesn't talk to you, you shouldn't be in the sky." The lead technician, Marcus, gasped. He looked at the man again, his eyes darting to the old faded name tag on the maintenance jacket. It was partially obscured by an oil stain, but the last name was clear. Keller. "David Keller?" Marcus whispered, his voice full of a reverence that stopped everyone in their tracks. "The David Keller from the X-90 project? The man who resigned after the North Atlantic test flight? We thought you left the industry to work for the government." The man, David, gave a small, humble nod. I didn't leave the industry. I just changed my priorities. My wife passed away, and I realized my daughter needed a dad who stayed on the ground more than the world needed an engineer who lived in the clouds. I fix regional systems now. It's quieter. It lets me pick her up from school at 3 p.m. The silence that followed was absolute. The nobody in the room was revealed as a legend, the man whose designs had paved the way for Langford Aerospace's own existence. Sophia felt a wave of shame wash over her like ice water. She had mocked a man who had forgotten more about aviation than her entire staff would ever know. She had judged the master by his coveralls. She had tried to buy the soul of a machine, but she had met the man who actually owned it. Sophia Langford felt the weight of every eye in the hangar. Her technicians were looking at her, then at David, their faces a mosaic of regret and awe. She realized that she had been leading with her ego instead of her eyes. She had been so focused on the image of success that she had become blind to the substance of it. She walked slowly toward David, her high heels sounding rhythmic and purposeful on the polished floor. She didn't look like a CEO about to issue a command. She looked like a woman who was finally beginning to understand the difference between power and authority. "David," Sophia said. Her voice was steady, but it had lost all of its icy professional edge. "I apologize. To you and to your daughter. I was incredibly short-sighted. I judged you by the uniform you wear today, and I was profoundly wrong. I've spent years looking for experts with the right degrees from the right schools, but I've been ignoring the people who actually know the soul of the machine." David looked at her, his expression neutral but not unkind. "It's a common mistake in buildings like these, ma'am. People get caught up in the optics and forget about the physics. But the physics always win in the end. Gravity doesn't care about your titles or your stock price." Sophia nodded, a genuine, humble smile touching her lips for the first time that day. "I think I'm beginning to realize that. Thank you for the lesson." She turned to her lead technician, her voice regaining its clarity but tempered with a new respect. "Marcus, get the alignment tools. Adjust the shim exactly as Mr. Keller directed. We run the test flight at noon, and I want every engineer on the floor watching what a real calibration looks like. This is how we build Langford machines from now on." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, his voice full of a new, sincere energy. The arrogance was gone. The room had been recalibrated. As the technicians went to work, the atmosphere in the hangar shifted from a workplace of fear to a classroom of respect. They weren't just fixing a helicopter anymore. They were learning from a master. David stood by the rotor, offering a few quiet suggestions to Marcus, who was listening as if his life depended on it. He showed them how to feel the tension of a bolt without needing a digital gauge. He showed them how to read the metal. Lily sat back on the bench, picking up her sketchbook again. She drew the helicopter, But this time she didn't draw the scary smoke or the red warning lights. She drew a big, bright yellow sun over the hangar, and her dad standing tall in the center. Sophia watched David as he spoke to her men. She saw a man who didn't need a corner office, a designer suit, or a press release to command a room. He just needed his truth in his hands. She realized that the Ice Queen of Langford Aerospace needed to melt a little more if she wanted her company to truly reach the heights she dreamed of. She had been looking for a solution in the numbers, but she had found it in a man who knew how to listen to the silence between the beats. The S9 was no longer just a machine to her, it was a lesson in humility. And as the rotors began to turn again for the final check, Sophia Langford stood in the center of the room, not as a boss, but as a student of the craft. The final test cycle was a masterpiece of silence. As the RPMs reached their peak, the vibration was non-existent. The tail rotor swept through the air with a musical, effortless grace that made the engineers hold their breath. The harmonic resonance was gone. Langford Aerospace was saved. As the pilot powered down the engines and the high-pitched whine faded into the quiet of the hangar, Sophia walked up to David. The technicians were already packing their tools, their heads held high with a new kind of pride. They weren't just workers anymore. They were craftsmen. "It's perfect," Sophia said, looking at the machine. She turned back to David, her eyes searching his for a flicker of something more than just professional courtesy. "You know, I'm a woman of my word, David. Looks like I owe you a kiss." David laughed, a warm, genuine sound that echoed through the hangar and made even the stoic Marcus smile. He shook his head slowly, his eyes kind. "Keep the kiss, ma'am. I'm a simple man. I'm just happy to see the helicopter fly safely. That's the only reward I'm interested in. My daughter gets to see her dad do his job correctly. That's enough for me." Lily pulled on her father's hand, a mischievous grin on her face. "Dad, can we watch it take off now? You said it would look like a giant blue dragonfly." Sophia smiled at the little girl, her expression softening. "He's right, Lily. It will. Why don't you both stay for the demonstration flight? You can watch from the executive balcony. We have the best hot chocolate in the county." David looked at the CEO. He saw the shift in her, the humanity that had been hidden under the armor of ambition. "I think we can manage that, but only if my daughter gets to ask the pilot about the lift-to-drag ratio. She's been studying her physics." Sophia laughed, a rich, vibrant sound that filled the hangar. "Deal. And David, next time you're in the area, maybe we can skip the maintenance inspection and just have coffee? I think I have a lot to learn about listening to the metal and what it means to be truly grounded." David smiled, gripping his leather toolkit. "Coffee sounds a lot safer than a kiss in a hangar full of engineers, Sophia." As the luxury helicopter lifted off for the investors, slicing through the bright Los Angeles sky like a blue dragonfly, Sophia Langford stood on the balcony beside a single dad and his daughter. She realized then that the most powerful thing in the world wasn't a billionaire's bank account or a CEO's title. It was the quiet integrity of a man who knew his value and the courage to stay true to it, even when the world was laughing. The hangar doors closed as the sun set. The room was different. The people were different. And for the first time in years, the Ice Queen was finally home. Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one who says the least. True respect is not given to the clothes we wear or the titles we hold. It is earned through the integrity of our actions and the depth of our expertise. Never judge a master by his coveralls. If you believe that real skill doesn't need a megaphone to be heard, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments, have you ever seen someone completely change a room just by doing their job right?